Craft Legacy was written and directed by Zoey Lister-Jones, and according to the IMDb synopsis, is in fact a sequel to the 1996 film The Craft, which I just recently reviewed in the 8th annual Halloween special. I'm a fan of that movie. There's things about it that I had problems with, things about it that I was hoping this film would address, and I wasn't entirely sure if this movie was going to be a straightforward reboot, a soft reboot, an actual sequel, or something else entirely. In the case of The Craft Legacy, technically, on paper, yes, this is a sequel, but in many ways, it's a soft reboot. This film also follows a young girl who's come to a school she's never been to before. She has abilities she's been keeping secret, and she meets 3 other young women who also have abilities that they're keeping secret, and they form a coven. If you saw my review of the first film, you know I really enjoy it. I have a lot of nostalgia for it. That movie is the 1990s exploding all over the screen as far as I'm concerned. The music, the fashion choices, the snide insults. That movie felt like it captured a part of my life on screen, even though I have some issues with the movie, and so I was simultaneously really excited, but also very concerned about this film. It is coming from Blumhouse. Their attempts at remaking properties or doing sequels to horror films many years later have not always worked for me. In fact, more often than not, they haven't worked for me. And unfortunately, The Craft Legacy is yet another film that didn't work for me. There are things about this movie that I like, and I'd like to talk about those first. I think Cailee Spaeny is really terrific in this movie. She was giving off major Audrey Hepburn vibes. I really want to see her do more work. My man David Duchovny's in the film, and I haven't seen him in anything in a long time, so it was refreshing to see him back in something. And I also like some of the ways the girls use their powers early on in the film. For one, there's a bully at school who's extremely mean and very over the top and sometimes a bit far-fetched. But they use a spell on him, and he suddenly becomes super woke and wants to talk about gender politics and all of these things that he had no interest in before, and I thought that was really clever. Besides that, I think a lot of this film just doesn't work. And much of it has to do with the characterization. And unfortunately, I'm going to compare it a lot to the 1996 film. It's inescapable. Like I talked about in my review for that movie, every single character was fleshed out. Every girl had something going on in their lives. One of them was dealing with a racist bully. The other had scarring and had to go through these really painful medical procedures. One had an abusive stepfather and a family life in a trailer park that was awful. And our lead was a new girl at a Catholic school who lost her mother and has no idea what she's doing in her life. And so all of those characters coming together, they had motivation. They had real concrete reasons for wanting to get out of their lives and embrace something like witchcraft to try to do that. And all of those characters, I think, are one of the biggest reasons that The Craft has a cult following all these years later, because people just love those characters. In this movie, there is virtually no attempt to give character to the 3 girls. Our lead gets a ton of it. She's the person we see everything through. We experience everything through her eyes. The other 3 girls, nothing. And I mean nothing. Zip. There is no attempt to characterize any of them. I know nothing about the characters at all, which is a major disappointment and by far my biggest issue with this movie. This film felt like Blumhouse's attempt at making a superhero movie because it treats the witchcraft like superpowers. Their motivation is non-existent. The reason that they want to have these abilities is because it would just be really nice. And when you don't know what the motivation of your characters are, it's tough to care about them. It's tough to want to follow them on a journey. The other issue with the movie is that certain things it changes made the movie worse. The first film took place in a Catholic school, and so there was this interesting contrast where all these girls are in this environment that's supposed to be very godly and extremely strict, and yet they're practicing this satanic stuff. It was this great contrast to everything else that was happening around them. This film, it's just a regular old school, and all the teachers are bored, and what did he fucking do? All the aspects of the original 1996 film that felt a little more religious or like they were talking more about the dark arts were taken away. In this film, there is no magic store or the woman who works there with the book and sort of warns them about spells and getting too close to things that could potentially be harmful to them. They have a book in the movie, and they seem to just magically know how to do everything. Once the 4 girls meet in the film, before you know it, they're doing insane witchcraft. One of them is using her fingers like it's a lighter, creating fire out of her hands. There's a montage sequence in which all of them experiment with their powers, and that's it. The light as a feather, stiff as a board scene from the original film is included in that montage for like a couple shots, and it's over in a second. And so we're sort of denied the fun of watching these girls discover how cool it is that they have all these abilities. It's just sort of brushed away really quick. That's another issue I had with the film, is that the witchcraft elements are very minimal. For the most part, this movie is actually a domestic thriller because Michelle Monaghan plays their lead character's mother, and she has a new boyfriend played by David Duchovny. And they're going to go live with him, and he has 3 sons, and nobody really gets along. And that's really the focus of the movie. And that's fine if you want to make a film that has supernatural elements, but it's really about something else. I mean, that's what all the best horror movies are. But the film doesn't have enough of the supernatural stuff, and so it relies on multiple dream sequences, a sequence where the main character wakes up and finds one of her stepbrothers sleepwalking into her room, which is never explained. She often gets visions of snakes and knives and eyes, and it doesn't feel like there's much of a resolution for those visions either. There's multiple loose ends when the film concludes. The last 15 minutes of the movie take a major nosedive in regards to storytelling structure. There's so many things left hanging when the film concludes that my jaw kind of dropped. There were so many storylines that were not resolved. It felt as if there must be a director's cut here somewhere. It felt like massive chunks of this movie have got to be on the cutting room floor. And during those last 15 minutes, the film introduces some of the worst special effects that I've seen in a big budget movie in years. There's some very subpar CGI in this movie, and I don't know if it had to do with the fact that this film was being edited during this pandemic and maybe they weren't able to complete it in the way they had envisioned. I don't know. I have no idea, because it honestly seems... Look, I have to talk spoilers. I'm going to be honest. If you haven't seen The Craft Legacy, I really have some things I'd like to discuss. So that's your warning. It is out now. I waited until the film was out to review it because I do want to talk about some spoilers. And let's start with that CGI. I actually screamed. I screamed. I could not believe my eyes, or David Duchovny's eyes. It was crazy. I was like, what? I was watching with my buddy, and we were like, what did it? So like I said, this is more of a domestic thriller than a supernatural fantasy coming-of-age film like the first one was. Because this film was essentially like that 2001 movie Domestic Disturbance with John Travolta and Vince Vaughn, except Vince Vaughn is a warlock. It's my best way to pitch it. Because Hannah realizes that David Duchovny is a warlock and that his job, which is a motivational speaker for men, is sort of wrapped up into this strange cult where everyone gets together in his living room and snaps their fingers, and he tells them not to be weak.
How do we eliminate the weakest among us so that the strongest can thrive?
As soon as she found a book in his library that was all about his views on masculinity, I was like, okay, he's going to be the villain. Of course, he's going to be the villain. And he was. And don't take this the wrong way. I don't have an issue with that. This isn't like, oh, the bad guys are man. I don't care. Like, there are tons of asshole guys in the world, of course. So that's perfectly fine. It's just that it felt very telegraphed and obvious from the beginning. The major issues I have with the way the ending goes down is that they all have this battle with David Duchovny as a warlock. He's trying to kill Hannah, while the other 3 girls are back at their place binding themselves so that they can't do any more spells, because a friend of theirs commits suicide and they think it's their fault. But then they all show up and it's like an Avengers meetup where they all have different colored mist around them, like green and blue and red and I think yellow. And they all just fight David Duchovny and they kind of trap him in a terrible CGI bubble. And he's like, oh no, I'm in a bubble. It was really bad. Like, I was truly concerned about I was concerned. And he starts talking about his master plan, of course, before he tries to kill any of them. But eventually they overpower him and he burns alive and dies. Now here's where we start to run into issues, because I'm talking the next scene. I'm talking cut to the next fucking scene. They're just on the sidewalk laughing. Hannah's mom picks her up in the car. They make a joke about how she shouldn't be looking to date warlocks, and they drive away. I'm like, wait a second. So this world famous public speaker was just burned alive in the forest. Was there no investigation? Was there not a single moment in which this girl's mother, who was dating him, said, What happened? Was there... What happened? That's what I would like to know. This is where I feel like there's got to be scenes missing from the movie. There has to be. There must be. Here's the other big loose end. His 3 kids. Her stepbrothers. Why was one of them sleepwalking? There's a young boy scene throughout the movie who seems to try to comfort her at times because he knows more than he's letting on. What happened to him? There's also a subplot in the movie, which is perhaps the best subplot in the film, actually, where the guy who was bullying her originally reveals to her in secret that he's bisexual and that he hooked up with her stepbrother at one point. And that stepbrother has been hiding that because his dad is this overbearing, toxic person. That's a great subplot, and all that's just thrown away. I guess everyone just accepted that he's a warlock and he burned alive in the woods. I don't know. It's just such a strange, complete disregard for storytelling craft. And in the beginning of the review, I mentioned that IMDb lists this as a sequel, and that is technically true. And that's because of the final scene. Hannah realizes she's adopted. Michelle Monaghan is not her real mother. And she goes to a hospital and meets Fairuza Balk from the first film, finds out my mom is actually her. As soon as I discovered that this character was adopted, I knew that was the direction they were going to go, and I like that. Unfortunately, she has no lines. She's just there. So the coolness of seeing that character that I love from the first movie is literally just one shot, and there's nothing happening in the scene. It really doesn't mean much for the story, unfortunately. Essentially, they made a soft reboot of The Craft, and the only reason they can call it a sequel is because they have one of the actresses at the end. Besides that, it's a soft reboot with an added storyline of domestic abuse. Here's something I couldn't help but notice, though. The ending of this movie and the events that take place in it are basically copy and pasted from Blumhouse's 2019 Black Christmas movie. At the end of that film, and obviously, spoilers if you haven't seen it, the lead girl is taken captive by the bad guy, and we reveal that it's somebody she knows in her personal life. He then explains his entire master plan to the lead character before trying to kill her, and then eventually all of her friends show up to save her, and an Avengers fight breaks out. And both of the bad guys burn alive. I actually couldn't believe it. I was looking forward to this movie. I am a fan of the first one. It's nostalgic for me, it's special for me, and I'm not seeing too many people enjoying this movie. I have a feeling that fans of the original are going to be disappointed like I was. I'm going to give The Craft Legacy a D. And I also want to give a thank you to the sponsor for this video, and that is In Search of Darkness Part 2. This is a documentary that's similar to the first film, which was very well received, by the way, delves deep into the history of horror films, particularly from the 1980s. That first film did very well. It was a fascinating look at so many talented individuals and their contributions to the horror genre. This will feature talents such as Robert Englund, Tom Savini, Nancy Allen, Clancy Brown, Robert Russler, John Carpenter, Doug Bradley, and 40 other returning casts from Part 1. And this specific package ends on October 31st, and it will never be available again. Please use this link to pre-order this documentary. That's going to help out my channel. If you guys already wanted to see it and you want to buy it, you can help me out by checking it out through this link. Guys, thank you so much as always for watching the 8th annual Halloween special. I hope you guys are enjoying it. If you like this, you can click right here and get Stuckmanized.